Hey everyone, today I'm going to show you how to remove the rear wheel knuckle on a Honda S2000. I'm removing the rear wheel knuckle on this car in order to install Carcep's rear wheel hubs, but you also might want to remove the rear wheel knuckle to replace it in the event that it is bent. The first thing you want to do is remove the rear axle nut. Unless you have a very powerful impact gun, you're going to want to do this while the car is on the ground. Remove the center caps from the rear wheels and use a 36mm socket with an impact gun or a 3/4 inch breaker bar to remove the nut. Depending on how tight your rear axle nut is, you may need to have somebody else step on the brakes to prevent the car from rolling. With the axle nut removed, you want to jack up the rear of the car, put it on jack stands, remove the rear wheels, and remove the parking brake. Now it's time to remove the brakes from the wheel knuckle. Remove the two caliper guide pin bolts, holding the brake caliper in place with a 12mm socket or wrench and a 17mm open end wrench. Place the 17mm wrench onto the slide pin and hold it in place while using the 12mm socket or wrench to loosen the bolts. Pull the caliper off and place it somewhere where it won't hang by the brake line. Pull the brake pads out of the caliper bracket and set them aside. Now use a 14mm socket to remove the two bolts securing the caliper bracket to the knuckle. Once removed, set the caliper bracket aside as well. Once the brake caliper is removed, you can remove the brake rotor. If you have screws securing the rotor to the hub, you will need to use a hand impact driver to remove them. Ideally, you should be using JIS bits, but you should be able to get away with Phillips head bits. Otherwise, you should be able to pull the rotor right off. Before you pop all the ball joints on the wheel knuckle, you'll need to remove the rear wheel speed sensor. Use a 10mm socket to remove the single bolt securing the wheel speed sensor to the wheel knuckle. It's not uncommon for the ABS sensor to be seized in place. If this happens to you, I recommend trying to break the ABS sensor free by tapping on the bottom of the sensor. The last thing holding the wheel knuckle to the car should be 3 ball joints. The process to pop each of them out is pretty much the same. The first thing you want to do is use a set of pliers to remove their cotter pins. Once the cotter pin is removed, use a 17mm socket or wrench and a rubber mallet to break the castle nuts free and remove them. You may need to use a wrench because there may not be enough clearance for a ratchet, like on the toe arm ball joint. Before using a ball joint separator, you must thread a hex nut onto the ball joint threads. This will serve two purposes. First, it'll prevent the ball joint from violently flying out of the wheel knuckle, and second, it will prevent the threads on the ball joint from being damaged by the ball joint popping tool. I recommend using a standard hex nut since the castle nut is much more fragile. Finally, use a ball joint separator to pop each of the ball joints out of the wheel knuckle. Once popped, remove the hex nut threaded onto the ball joint. Removing the hex nut from the upper control arm can be particularly tricky since the control arm is under some tension. You will need to apply some downward force on top of the upper control arm in order to remove the hex nut. You should now be able to remove the wheel knuckle from the car. Remove any of the ball joints from the knuckle and pull it out from the rear axle. Stay tuned for my next video, which will cover replacement of the rear wheel hub and bearing.